We have an exciting keynote speaker, the Director of Department of Rehab, Xavier. Joe has 36 years of experience in business and public administration, as well as many years participating in advocacy and community organization. He understands the challenges and opportunities available to individuals with disabilities and the services required to maximize an individual's full potential. Joe also believes in the talent and potential of individuals with disabilities. He believes in pursuing excellence through continuous improvement and preserving the public trust through compassionate, responsible provision of services. So please join me in welcoming Joe Xavier.
All right, well, thank you. Let me just first start by sharing with all of you that it's a great honor to be here and to be a part of your conversation and contribute to the discussion. Just applaud the leadership of the State Disability Advisory Committee, as well as the Disability Advisory Committees across all the departments that help improve the opportunity for individuals with disabilities to go to work in the various departments, as well as to have promotional opportunities within those departments. And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge and send our thoughts and best wishes to everyone who's been impacted by the fires, the heat waves, the power outages, the bad air quality, and not to mention COVID-19, amongst many other things that we're all dealing with. So I trust everybody is staying as safe as you can. These are challenging times that we're all living through, and we will get through them nonetheless. So this morning, I wanted to provide some perspective to you from the state level on the telework opportunity, to share with you how Department of Rehabilitation approaches both telework and reasonable accommodations. But more importantly than just me talking to all of you, we welcome the opportunity to get into a conversation with you, whether it's through a question and answer format or however you choose to really hear from you and engage with you in those areas that are of interest and concern to you. As part of the context, let me share a couple of things around COVID-19 that I think are very important to the discussion that I just described. One of the things that we know is that to have meaningful change, you really need to disturb the present. I think we would all agree that the present has been disturbed, significantly so. Although COVID-19 did not create the challenges that we're facing, it really has exacerbated a lot of these challenges, right? So Dr. Galley from our agency often says that COVID-19 both unmasked and is an accelerant to what was present. Didn't necessarily create other than illness and death, what we experience today. We know that, for example, many of the things like telework, but you think about how that's been accelerated in ways that we had not conceived of, both by COVID-19 as well as the other issues that we have been facing. Think about retail and how much that has escalated in the online world. Think about education that has, taken place. So why am I describing all that? Because this really provides a monumental opportunity for some really significant change within the state, how the state does business and the state's workforce, right? And if you keep thinking about how the state has been doing accommodations, and think about the accommodations that people are getting now for online education that they were not getting. I think in some ways you guys have already experienced, and I think we'll continue to see how even providing accommodations for those individuals who are remote working. So the idea here is not that we just do this within COVID-19, but we do this beyond COVID-19. And I think it's important that we recognize that the change that we have seen in the last 4 or 5 months would otherwise have taken 5, 10, 15 years to make this kind of change, right? So what does telework look like from the state perspective? All of our departments, collectively, the administration, what is that looking like? Well, we already know that it has already resulted in greater flexibility for the state's workforce. We know that in some areas it's increased productivity. We know that it has made us much more resilient to the emergency. So our ability to continue providing services and to do our work has really changed with what has already taken place. We know that it's reduced the state's carbon footprint. So think about all the folks that were previously commuting to and from work, not just within the state, but even across all sectors who are now not doing that, and how that is impacting the state's carbon footprint. We also know that the state has really looking at how we continue that work in a more broader sense. So it's not just what we've done to this point, but when state starts to look at all its leased facilities, how do we now restack those leases in a way that reduces the brick and mortar costs for the state, right? We know that there's an opportunity and a belief that this shift to telework is going to improve the opportunity for recruitment. So people who otherwise might not come to work for this state will have an opportunity to do so. And if I were to speak specifically to individuals with disabilities, for many, they're going to have an opportunity to go to work where otherwise they may not have had that opportunity. We know transportation often is a major barrier to employment, as an example. So now people that have the opportunity to work remotely are not dealing with transportation as a barrier that needs to be mitigated in order to go to work. And so then, of course, what all this means is, how do we really look at making sure that telework is not just here today, but that it continues in this fashion? And all of you would have received a letter from Secretary of GovOps, Yolanda Richardson, that really laid out some of these things. So I'm really highlighting with you something that you've seen, but I think it's really important that we all understand what's the context and what's the framework that the broader state is looking at these issues. What's the lens that they're looking through? All right, how does the Department of Rehabilitation look at reasonable accommodations? And how does the Department of Rehabilitation look at increasing the workforce of people with disabilities within the state's workforce, right? How do we get more people with disabilities employed by the state? First of all, we have a cultural commitment to both diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'm not saying that other departments don't. I'm just saying this is how we at the Department of Rehabilitation are really focusing on this. We have, and we are very intentional about ensuring that disability and inclusion is visible and present at all levels of the organization. That's on our executive team, that's on our senior leadership team, that is across all of our workforce. So 30% of our workforce identifies as having a disability. 40% of our leadership identifies as having a disability. And we do not view reasonable accommodations as a privilege here at the department. We view it in the same way that we would view providing somebody with a telephone or a desk or a restroom. It's the same kind of mindset that we apply to accommodations. It is something that is needed and is appropriate and is required for individuals to carry out their duties and perform their functions in an effective way. And when we think about that, we look at it both from a digital, from a programmatic, and a physical accessibility. So it's not just on one end of that we look at that. We look at it in that wide spectrum. And we start with the premise that accessibility is not a step or an action. It's an ongoing commitment. It's an ongoing expectation. It's an ongoing behavior by all of us. In other words, it's not one and done. It's a repeated, reoccurring, adjusting as is needed as individuals continue in the workforce. And we embrace the value of making it accessible up front. So let me use digital accessibility as an example. When a document is created, no matter where it's created in the organization, right from the outset, we are saying that document must be accessible and must be created in a way that individuals who are blind can access it, individuals who have cognitive disabilities can access it, individuals that have any other kind of limitation that they need to be accommodated for, that document is prepared. Again, that is the same for both programmatic and physical access, of course. And the other thing that I think is important that we do here at the department is the invisible, the hidden disability, right? We need to recognize that when somebody is having a heart attack, we embrace that person. We rush to them and we render aid. When somebody is having a psychotic episode, we shun them and we run away from them, call the police. And that's not okay. We need to embrace an individual that has a psychotic episode in the same way that we embrace somebody that is having a heart attack. And we need to make sure that we foster an environment that is sufficiently safe for an individual to disclose an invisible disability. They need to feel comfortable that that will not be held against them, that they will in fact receive appropriate supports. But that's not good enough to just do that. We also have to prepare and support our management in their ability and in having the tools and having the resources to both understand and effectively engage an individual with an invisible disability. So when we talk about disability, it's important to know that what we are really thinking about is it's individualized to every person, right? So no two blind people experience blindness in the same way. So we start by saying, what is it that Joe, as a result of his blindness, needs? And we individualize to that basic need. We do that even with assistive technology. So as an example, my preferred and my method of communication is through a screen reader, meaning instead of writing, I'm using a screen reader. Some people might use Braille. So we start with what is it that works for that individual on all spectrums, and that's how we decide what is the appropriate accommodation. The other thing that we do here at the department is when reasonable, right? When it's feasible, we defer to what works for that individual. And let me give you a real example of what that might look like. So I use a screen reader, and there might be 2 or 3 screen readers on the market. If I am somebody who has learned and has effectively mastered the use of JAWS as an example, regardless of what we as an organization may have available, if JAWS is what works for me, then JAWS is what we want to provide. And a couple of reasons for that is that it really minimizes the learning curve and it leverages that person's skill set that they've already developed to use that assistive technology. The other thing that we pay close attention to is, there's always a lot of conversation around the cost of an accommodation. But there's another element that we really pay close attention to. So yeah, while it's true that my reasonable accommodations might cost, a couple of $1,000s, sometimes we get caught up in that couple of $1,000s. But what I often say to folks is, how much do we pay that person to sit around in salary if they're not able to effectively do their job? And that cost is much more significant than the cost of the accommodation. So we really coach the folks that are involved in the procurement of accommodations to recognize that the cost of accommodation is not nearly the cost associated with somebody who was not able to perform their duties, not to mention the social, the personal, and the professional impact on the individual because they don't have that cost there. So let's talk about disabilities for a second. So, obviously our mission is to provide the programming and the service that is necessary for somebody to keep a job, to get a job, or to advance in employment, right? So we very much look at that as not only our mission when we're working with our consumers, but that's also part of how we look at the state as an employer. That includes us as a department as an employer. So part of that is to do some of the work that we're doing with the diversity task force, the governor's diversity task force. An element of that is how do we increase the employment opportunity for people with disabilities within the state's workforce. Many of you will be familiar with LEAP. That's one such vehicle. And we're looking at other strategies to employ and deploy to improve the opportunity for people with disabilities to go to work in all of the state departments across the state. All right, so let's talk a little bit about telework and how that has affected people with disabilities in our department, and I'm going to guess that by extension across the other departments. So first of all, let's start with the telework policy, right? But what I want to start with here is by saying that this information that I'm sharing is from how we approach this, but I largely think you guys are probably going to have experiences that are very relatable to this. So we start with the policy that we've had in place for a long time, that individuals do have the opportunity to work remotely. So the ability for individuals with disabilities to work remotely did not start with COVID-19 for us. That has been in place for quite some time. And so what we do is we provide the assistive technology that is necessary for the individuals to do so. So in our case, we have greatly benefited from the fact that working remotely was an expectation that included people with disabilities for quite some time. So they have both the assistive technology and we have the infrastructure in place that allows that to take place. So I'm able, as an example, to sit at my desk at home and be connected to the workplace in the same way that everybody else is. And frankly, it would be hard for anybody to tell which computer I'm sitting at when it comes for my ability to do my job here at the department. And we also, of course, look at what are the things that are challenging as people move into that place, right? So in some cases, individuals may not have had the technology. So we've been working to provide those individuals with that technology as we have progressed and increased into telework. There were some classifications, as an example, people that were doing more of the administrative functions that may not have had all of the technology they needed to telework. We have been providing that to them so they have the opportunity to do so, whether they have or do not have a disability. But then the other thing that comes to play is what are the supports necessary for people to work remotely? So think about support services assistance, general support services assistance, interpreting. We continue to make those supports available to individuals who need them, even if they are teleworking. And so that is something that we're paying close attention to. And of course, each of those comes from a little bit of a different perspective. The other thing that we're paying close attention to is the workplace socialization. Workplace socialization is a key aspect of our culture, of all of our cultures across our organizations. And it's something that we cannot lose as we've changed to working in a remote environment, right? The other thing that I can tell you is that our experiences and our practices will continue to evolve. Why is that? Well, we've learned a great deal as we've done more of a mass migration to telework. And as we learn, we'll continue to adapt our system, our practice, our processes to ensure that we're benefiting from, those experiences and, about what works and what doesn't work. So are employees with disabilities having their needs met while teleworking? Well, again, we individualize to that person. So what somebody needs in a telework status if they're blind is going to vary from person to person. It depends on the job that they're performing, right? What are the duties that they're performing? And how is performing of those duties in a remote setting different than the face-to-face setting? So we look at that very closely and we individualize to that. And again, I already mentioned, providing that assistive technology. So think about, for me as somebody who's blind, I may need somebody that reads materials for me. So the question now becomes, if I'm teleworking, how does that materialize? Well, things that we would need to consider as an example would be, are those hard copy materials? Are those digital materials? If they're digital, the approach to having somebody read those to me might be different than if they're hard copy. For example, if they're digital, that person might also be able to be sitting at home and read those to me. Or if they're hard copy, maybe that person doesn't need to come to the office, or maybe we need to get the materials to that person so they're able, to read those to me. So that's just one example of how we individualize the supports that we provide to the person. Same thing for interpreting services. So if an individual requires an interpreter, can they use remote, whether it's through Teams or Zoom or video phones? So what is the condition, what is the setting that they need to provide interpreting for, and what's the way that can be, accommodated? Should employees that are teleworking have accommodations set up at their homes? So we always start what helps that individual perform their duties. So if it helps that individual performs their duties, the answer then is yes, we do make it available. The question that we often ask is, was that individual working previously or remotely? The answer to that is yes, and the question is, so what has changed? Right? If the answer to that is no, then what is needed for them to be able to provide that? We have provided sit-stand desks, chairs, ergonomic chairs, scanners, technologies, the whole range of whatever is necessary for that individual to function remotely is the approach that we take in terms of providing that accommodation in a telework setting. So I'm going to stop chatting so we can get into conversation, but what I want to do is just close this up with a couple of thoughts. First of all, again, I just applaud the work of the State Disability Advisory Committee, as well as the Disability Advisory Committees for the work you're doing. It is important work. You should know that, and I would just encourage you to keep it up. Nobody said it was easy. Nobody said it was painless. And if it was either of those, probably not worth doing. So yeah, sometimes you are going to face challenges, and you can't shy away from that as you do the work that you're doing. I certainly welcome you guys sharing our practices with anyone else, and to the extent that you do, and other folks within your organizations have an interest in conversations with us, we welcome that. Whether it be individuals who are procuring your accommodations, whether it be individuals in our Office of Civil Rights. We're open to sharing our practices with anyone because it really does benefit the individuals with disabilities in the workplace, not just those that are there today, but those that will have an opportunity to go to work, for the state tomorrow. So we also want to point out that you have the assistive technology directory, which is available as a resource to all departments in terms of providing both goods and services to support reasonable accommodations. And I really am welcome hearing from you on what are the things that you are experiencing, what are the areas that, as a Department of Rehabilitation, with our role in the state, that you think we should also help give attention to, whether it's both from a policy or a systems perspective. Welcome hearing, how individuals with telework disabilities might be impacted by telework. What are some of the areas that would be beneficial to hear about there? So, what are the voices? What are the considerations that we should be including in policy and planning? As we do some of the work that I've already described that has taken place. So I'm going to stop there. Love to open this up to conversation, to hearing from all of you, and let's just get into a conversation. So Bobby and Eduardo, I'll kick this back over to you, and love to pick up a conversation on what I've shared and any interest that you have.
Great. Thank you so much, Joe. That was so informative and useful to our members. And we thought it was beneficial to simply start with the chat questions and then open it up for the verbal inquiries that may come in, if that's okay with you.
Absolutely.
Great. So Susan is going to help us present those questions that came through the chat. Go ahead, Susan.
Hi, Joe. So we had two main questions that came in. We had one that came in that was asking from Kim Liu, can DOR share their telework policy with SDAC members? Our department has established a work group to address teleworking that will include policy writing.
Yes.
So yes, so we'll put that down. And
we'll get it over to you folks, and you guys can decide how to distribute it.
Great.
And then Randy had a question, which I think you covered a little bit, but it was, or you covered to some extent, but do people with disability need a reasonable accommodation to be able to telework? Is telework limited?
So for us, no. Telework is not limited because somebody has a disability. What decides whether a person can or cannot telework is their duties. Right? Are they performing duties that can only be done, being actually in the workplace, or are they performing duties that can be done remotely? 9 out of 10 times, it's a combination of both. Right? And so we approach telework that way. It's not based on disability itself.
And then, Joe, we had a comment from David Meyer that said that depends on the individual department policy on telework. It has been coming up in some recent EEO complaints, and we at the EEO office don't have a clear answer yet. Hopefully, the complaint will assist in clarifying the issue. And as my commentary, I've heard some concerns from people at my last agency where they were saying, trying to get accommodations at home was a bit of a struggle.
I think that is correct. Again, what I shared with all of you is how the Department of Rehabilitation is approaching, right? So clearly, we're not the ones setting policy for other departments. What we are willing to do is, to the extent that another department is wanting some conversation about how we're approaching it, we are totally open to that. We're not dictating, hey, Department X, you should do it this way, okay? Because we don't know what the environment is there. We don't know, all of what's at play in that department. And, frankly, it's overstepping our role a bit. Okay, so just as we share our telework policy, yes, but that's DOR's, right? That's not your department's. The question is, when you guys get our telework policy, then what?
Karen asked, would we go to the employee's home to help assist with issue in the home, or would it depend on each agency's policy?
Well,
Which I think you were kind of alluding to, that each agency has to set their own policy.
Yeah, I mean, they clearly have to set their own policy. And I want to also all raise another issue. It should be standardized, but isn't. I want to just put a question mark on that for you folks, for all of us to think about. So it's enticing for things to be consistent and standardized. And I agree with that to the extent that that is used as a floor and not a ceiling. And the reason I say that is it's keeping in mind no two individuals are the same. No two individuals experience the same disability in the same way. And so when we start to standardize this, we start to eliminate the basic principle of individualizing to the person. So it's much more important to me to start with the person first and then say, and what do we need to do so this will work? Because what you do for Joe, you may not need to do for anybody else and vice versa.
So, Joe, we have Jennifer asking, will CaliCHAR have a standardized policy that the state agency can use an example to proceed with their telework policies?
I don't know that it's CaliCHAR. I think DGS is the one that is working on a statewide policy. And my understanding is that is likely to be a model policy that departments will then use to build on. Clearly we're all revisiting our policies as we've moved into this arena. Departments that already had policies in place, have a start point. But, even us, we're having to think in some ways about, that policy and how effective is it in today's real experiences.
It's Eduardo.
Okay.
Mr. Xavier, I am sight impaired. I am also a former Department of Rehab client. So, and I do appreciate everything that your department does for the disabled community. My own experience was very positive. So without changing the subject, I'd like to get your take on how do you feel if, for example, I went to an interview and I don't mark down on the application that I need accommodations and I don't let the folks interviewing me know ahead of time and I just show up with my own adaptive technology and my own magnifying glass and I don't say anything. Do you think that's kind of deceptive to the people that are interviewing you? Or I've done that to show, I'm going to show that I might have a disability, but I can do it on my own without anyone's help. That's kind of the point that I try to make when I've gone to interviews. I'm not going to tell them I need accommodation. I'm just going to bring my own, and if they feel I was deceitful, well, then that's their issue. I'd like to get your take on that.
So the issue of disclosure is a long-standing conversation across all disabilities. Here's my personal view, and here's my approach to it. And then I'll let you and others, judge that against or hold that up against your own approach and, take it with a grain of salt.
Okay.
Yes, for some individuals, like you're describing, there are things that you don't need accommodation for, so it's a non-issue. You can demonstrate in an interview setting that you just using magnification, you get to go. In my case, if I know that they're going to be doing a written interview, and I don't tell them in advance that I am not able to simply sit at any computer, I've not given them a fair opportunity to accommodate me. And so if I want a fair opportunity for them to accommodate, my ability to write, because I can write just fine. I'm just not going to do it in a traditional way at any old computer. I'm going to have that conversation up front. In my case, there's no pretending that I'm blind. The minute they open the door and see me, they're going to see my white cane, and they're going to see me maybe even potentially not looking in the right way until there's some audible cues for me to key in on. So I think you have to consider your own circumstances, your own unique needs that are unique to each person. For me, I want a partnership between myself and that interview panel so they can see my best. And then, when that happens, then I feel like I'm going to have a fair shot at demonstrating the talent they're looking for and being given that opportunity. But I will tell you, other folks, depending on your disability, depending on, what accommodations may or may not be needed in the interview, never mind in the job setting.
I don't mean to jump in line of questions, but I have to agree. This is Alex Meshtahedi with Director Xavier. I've been on the other end of that where I was on the hiring panel, and normal standard practice, we ask it wasn't me, it was one of the personnel liaisons, asked the candidates, do you need any accommodation? It was just part of the standard script, and that was the way that agency did it. So making no judgment on that, and they said no. They showed up. Turns out they did. So that actually threw off the entire interviewing process because she had seen the questions ahead of time, and a lot of special things had to be done because you want to be fair to every candidate. So I have to double down on what you're saying there, Joe, because I've been on the other end of that, and it's a partnership. So, I wanted to make sure that she had just as fair a chance. But then again, having her come back after the software was available for her gave her an advantage. So I had to rebalance the questions. It was not fun, but I agree with you that it depends on your own individual slant. But I think that partnership, I really want to double down on that. So providing more context for you, Eduardo.
Okay, thank you.
So we are just enjoying this so much that we have too many questions for you. Mindy asked, I wonder if Joe could expand on what he means by workplace socialization and what are the options. So since we do have the use of many technologies, Skype, Teams, Zoom, etc. And then the second question was from Robin. Do you feel with telework being made available to the pandemic that agencies are going to have a tougher time articulating undue hardship to provide RA? So sorry, two questions at once, Joe.
Yeah. So let me tackle the last one first. So undue hardship does not get changed because somebody's in telework. At least as a sort of a first approach to that. And the undue hardship is linked to an accommodation the person needs. And so we don't know what that is. So you have to really be able to look at that and again, individualize that to the person. But as a broad piece, I don't know that undue hardship would necessarily change just because somebody is going through telework. Okay. And the second part of that, what do we mean by workplace socialization? Well, let me share my own personal experience. So all of my life, I have fought to be integrated, to be included, to feel welcomed, and just be part of every workplace. The ability to walk down the hallway, pop into somebody's office and say, hey, how was your weekend? How are the kids? What's going on? Hey, how about let's go to lunch? Hey, you got a minute? I'd like to pick your brain about this and that or the other. The person does the same to me. We build that camaraderie. We have the water cooler chat. We have the conversations that occur in the hallways to and from. Hey, we're all thinking of going to lunch. You want to go with us? Or, hey, how about you guys? You want to go to lunch? Whatever, right? You have all that. Well, how much of that is occurring in this virtual environment? It's not. So we have to be very intentional about creating this space for those same kind of conversations. Because the last thing that we as people with disabilities want is to be isolated again, right? So that's what I mean by workplace socialization. And even though we have the ability to use all the video platforms, I don't know about you folks, but yes, a video chat is much more meaningful than a phone call, but it's not the same as a face-to-face conversation. Just not the same. Okay? I mean, we're human beings. We're all social creatures. And so that social aspect of us should not and cannot be taken for granted. We're having to be very intentional about creating the space, the opportunity, and we're going to learn a lot over the coming months and years about how to do this.
Thank you, Joe. Really appreciate your wisdom and the comments, and you've been extremely helpful in clarifying a lot of burning questions that many of our SDAC members had. My question to you is, I know you mentioned the Secretary of GovOps, you mentioned DGS, and then you mentioned all the departments in connection with the telework policy. How does it all reconcile? And in a way, what I'm trying to find out logistically, how would that work? Would DGS come up with the main policy and then GovOps will approve it and send it to all the departments? And since you mentioned the departments are unique in their respective functions and programs, how would they then implement their respective policies within the guidance of what GovOps and DGS will come up with? That's my question.
So, yeah, that's a good question. So let me start by saying this is not new because of COVID-19, right? This is something the state has been dealing with for decades and decades. So we here at the Department of Rehabilitation, when we looked at establishing our telework policy, we looked at the model policy that was put out by, DGS. And then we went through the process of saying, all right, if this is our start point, what do we need here to make this operational, practical, usable, and effective for our department? And, we put that in place. We vetted it, we got it approved, and, approved meaning, the executive leadership agreed to it and got it in place, and then we operationalized it. Not much more complicated than that. Now, does that policy look like, I don't know, pick another department? Probably not. But the policy is written for our environment, for the services, the way that we do business, not for the way another department does. I think that would be true about anybody else's policy. And here's what I would encourage all of you. You can get caught up in the mechanics of how something happens. But as an advisory body, both at the state level and at the department level, what I would encourage you to think about is what needs to be in the policy so that individuals with disabilities have an equitable opportunity to telework. And that to me is where the focus is. How it happens, I would just leave that to the people that need to figure it out. It's what does it need to contain?
Joe, this is Susan, and I actually completely agree with you. I think one of our roles as a part of our local DACs or the SDAC is as advocates and activists. I mean, I really would call all of us activists, even if it's only internal activists. Mm-hmm. And that part of the power that we have is you've just given us a whole bunch of really great information about here's this agency and the way they're doing it. when we get a copy of that, we now have the power to take that to our agency and say, look, the Department of Rehab has set a baseline. Can we try to emulate this? Can we use this as a guide? And then we can have that conversation. You know, sometimes some agencies may not be able to adapt the same policies that your agency has been able to. But if nobody starts the conversation, we never get anywhere. So that's my personal comment.
Yeah, well said.
Well, at this point, we can open it up for any verbal questions that anybody else wishes to pose.
Hi, my name's Elizabeth Huber, and I'm a branch chief at the California Energy Commission and the newly elected chair of our Disability Advisory Committee. And I want to thank you for speaking today. I've already shared your name with our public advisor to be a judge on a California awards program we're doing. So look for Noemi calling you. Okay. But my question is, one of the challenges we're having at the Energy Commission, and I've gone through reasonable accommodations. I have asthma. If we're finding with our staff is the challenge of reasonable accommodations. People will have their doctor's notes, or we are pretty flexible at the commission, but it's the implementation why everybody's remote. And so do you suggest we do like Zoom calls or team calls, or do you have staff that actually will go out to somebody's home? How are you guys implementing that right now? Or are you still working up a process that could work during this time of COVID? Thank you.
I think here's what I would start with in terms of what you described, right? The accommodations process is an interactive discussion conversation. And so what is necessary for that conversation to take place? Can if folks are doing it video, do it video. They're doing telephone, do telephone. I think what you get into when you get into does somebody have to go to the place is, are you having to provide some kind of accommodation at the home that requires some kind of site visit? Okay, that's the question. Now, remember, for us, this is not new, right? We already were doing that. So the accommodations process was already in place. Telework was already in place. It just got accelerated, rather quickly in a matter of weeks. More people moving to it, not that any of it was new. But don't lose sight of the basic principles of the interactive process. It's a conversation between the supervisor and the employee. Okay, what are the limitations? Okay, what are the barriers? And what are the mitigating things that we can do?
Any other questions?
Thank you.
Hi, this is Dave Mayer from the Employment Development Department. The question for you, I know that we do a lot of preaching to the choir here because we are all have the same mindset that we are here to really look at people as individuals and work with people's abilities as opposed to their disabilities. Do you have any suggestions or pointers on how we can frame things for management and executives in our department that will help them to see the value in providing these reasonable accommodations? And because everything really needs is a business model, right, in a lot of people's eyes. So would you suggest that we really try to look at the end result and the value of giving somebody a reasonable accommodation or affording them the accommodations, so the bottom line is that they're more productive, there's more business sense to it?
I would. I think it's about two things. I think it's clearly every person was hired because they brought value to the organization. And to maximize that value, the person needs to be able to effectively do their job. Right? I don't think anybody would argue with that. And to me, it's no different than hiring a, quote, non-disabled person and saying, well, maybe we'll give you a telephone, maybe we'll give you a computer, maybe we'll give you a desk. We don't even think about that. We provide it because it's needed for the person to do the job. Same thing. Number two, this is a California for all. We have a governor that has made that about as crystal clear as could be said. For all means all. When we talk about diversity and equity and inclusion, we're talking about everybody feeling welcomed and belonging in the workplace, right? So we wouldn't dare suggest that people who are of color sit over there or don't do this. Hey, this is no different. So yes, the value, absolutely. But let's not forget the person, the humanness. We treat everybody that way. Again, and you heard me say this. Why is it we don't even think twice about providing bathrooms in the workplace or desks or lights? Can you know how much energy we'd save if we didn't have to provide lights for all the sighted people? Okay. So yes, that's absurd. But frankly, it's what I challenge our folks to think about. So it's shifting that mindset. I really appreciate this. You guys know how to get a hold of me. If there are other questions, send them to me. Be glad to send back, some thoughts on those questions. I will get our telework policy over to you folks. You guys can, have the benefit of that and go from there. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Joe. We really appreciate your attendance and presence here. It's been valuable. So sorry we can't.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
All right. Take care.
Thank
Be well,
you
everybody.
so much.
Bye-bye.
Stay safe.